The nature of reality is explored in Rick and Morty. A scientist of sufficient skill to manipulate reality at will, creating whatever shared reality for the people and entities important to him that he wishes, and influencing them to a point of such intense manipulation that it eventually pushes them all away, even if they have to live with the fact that he is essentially still a god in their universe. The fact that he is not benevolent, that he'll grant them wishes but never really connect or be emotionally available in ways that are desired or meaningful, especially because he avoids accountability, means that they'll just never really connect with or understand him. He encourages existential apathy, nihilism, and misanthropy in himself and in those close to him, not because he's just above them and too complicated for them to get to grips with, but because he closes himself off from the possibility of sharing his internal world with others in a real and vulnerable way, and instead tries to change everyone's shared reality to fit the version of what he wishes his internal reality was. Welcome back to my weird, chatty revision series that I've called GCSE Minecraft and Chill, a rambly exploration of the science and maths topics I find interesting to talk about while playing Minecraft to entertain myself and maybe you. As usual, I hope you have a drink and something to do while you listen or watch along, and that your day has gone well so far, especially before we explore this existential crisis of a video. It was a bit of a heavy opening, but I promise it is relevant, and if you stick around you'll understand why. So I already talked about the particle model of matter twice on this channel, so it seems tedious to talk about the exact same thing again, despite this technically being a revision video for the particle model topic of GCSE physics. So I decided that we would talk about a slightly adjacent topic of interest, especially because, well, there is nothing that isn't matter or particles, so I suppose I could talk about anything, but I actually had no intention when I started scripting this of making it a Rick and Morty video per se. I wanted to just zoom out and talk about reality, about matter and energy, the scientific method, and gravity and space in ways that interest me and why I find physics so worth studying. And I ended up realizing during the scripting process that these are literally some of the thoughts that I've had after watching Rick and Morty, and how it all connects together for me, and why I find Rick so compelling as a character, and what I think the lesson is for scientists moving into the future of our world. So this video is kind of the chaotic amalgamation of all of those thoughts. First, our story of life, the universe and everything, begins, as it always seems to with me, with a little bit of a history lesson. Cast your mind back to the days of ancient peoples, what they knew, how they lived. Humanity was there thriving with innovations in agriculture, community, and knowledge production. They relied on what they could observe, document, and report back to one another, and understood the patterns of the cosmos, the seasons, the land, and each other, and developed successful societies on those principles and intelligences. And naturally, as a scientist, the scientific method has always fascinated and intrigued me. I have a lot of respect for it and its development over time, but I don't think I ever really appreciated it the way I came to when I started developing an interest in epistemology. Epistemology is the study of our philosophy of knowledge and understanding. It is a broad and an ancient field, and I became especially interested a few years ago when taking a short course on the process of decolonizing our understanding and practice within education generally, in the context of universities and knowledge production. It remains an evolving, dynamic, and amazing field that ties everything in that interests me, the nature of our shared realities on Earth and beyond, especially with sociological lenses and perspectives. Really important for a scientist, because you might argue that a scientist's primary concern should be producing scientific knowledge, but that's kind of a bit hard to do if we don't agree on what scientific knowledge even is or what that means. Most of the modern understanding and agreement on what scientific knowledge production is relies on what we refer to as the scientific method, which boils down to hypothesizing, experimenting, reporting, and independently verifying results and conclusions to produce incremental bits of generally agreed upon scientific consensus about a particular facet of our shared reality. There's lots of specifics, nuances, factors, and so on that go into what is considered scientific, especially in a so-called age of misinformation, but I think it's fair to say that what is empirical or observed, reproducible, and falsifiable are the headlining criteria for a piece of scientific knowledge. I wouldn't normally specifically recommend a Wikipedia article. It should always just be for general reference to springboard you to other sources, but the one on the history of the scientific method is particularly interesting and clearly written. All links and references are going to be in the description as usual. Today's list is hefty, but I do recommend that you take a look, see what takes your fancy. The idea of empirical observations, perceptions, what we see, what we sense, what we know, is what we experience and interact with our senses, or these days with our sensors and machines that give us data in the forms of zeros and ones, translated into numbers and shapes we can understand. Scientific knowledge, what we essentially agree as a community is factual, real, evidenced reality and knowledge, comes about from our perceptions and what our senses or senses pick up on. This idea, still basically the main pillar of scientific knowledge production, goes right back to the beginning of ancient North African and South and Southwest Asian societies, philosophers and knowledge producers. Particularly, this philosophy that was popular amongst a certain group of Buddhists is called Charvaka philosophy. It wasn't popular because of its atheistic nature. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? But it was essentially the first philosophy that said explicitly what we know is what we perceive. That's what we have to agree as real and logical and rational. And isn't that amazing that essentially all of the tools and ideas that we rely on to produce what we agree as real hasn't changed in all of that time? There are other ancient philosophers, especially in Sanskrit texts, that had theories of what atoms were, of how energy exists in fields, how it moves through our bodies and the universe and our consciousness. And they understood somehow, with what they were able to observe and intuit perhaps at the time, that the grand cosmic scale of our universe was reflected on the tiny particle level. There's one particular philosopher that I want to draw attention to, as he may be the earliest natural scientist, and I really enjoyed reading this book, Matter and Mind, by Subhash Kak, which is a modern translation into English of Kanada's philosophies from the Sanskrit texts. He proposed the atomic nature of particles and distinguished that there will be some with mass and those without that are related to energy and light, which is just fascinating. He also intriguingly proposed laws of gravity and motion that are strikingly similar to Newton's laws. And just as Newton and scientists since, especially Einstein, noted the importance of understanding the influence of the observer on the reality or phenomenon that you're trying to observe, almost as though it's some kind of hindrance or inconvenience to trying to obtain pure or raw data, that separating the two is a necessary goal for rationality. But in Kanada's philosophy, the nature of the observer is inherent to the observation. The reality of the two are intertwined. That is the logic of it. That is the nature of reality and how to understand it. There is no need to separate them if you understand them. And again, as I usually want to do, I relate this back to Uncle Iroh and the false separation of the elements and the boundaries that we erect between subjects. The way we categorize things, these are arbitrary separations that don't exist in actuality, only in our minds, but this does influence the way that we perceive and interact with our reality, so the two are intertwined. So whether you're musing in the middle of the night in deep chats with your friends, or in any liminal, existentially suspended moment where you think about what is real, what is reality, how would you even know, how would you tell, how does anyone tell, what does it mean to make an observation, what is the secret to life, the universe, and everything, you might find that you are actually quite validly questioning our logic systems and the limitations of what we do and don't know or agree on, and how our senses and our minds can be so easily deceived, warped, limited by frames of reference and the influence of our mind on our observations, or the opposite, that we can just simply imagine whatever we want, and that makes us kind of an unreliable source of making an observation, right? And this concept still pervades today in the split between theoretical and experimental physics. The idea is that you're supposed to be able to verify your ideas and validate them with real experimental proof and data in order to develop scientific knowledge. Ibn al-Haytham, a medieval scientist from Iraq whose work pretty much inspired every other scientist in the 20th century. Yeah, I bet you've never heard of him, right? Anyway, the development of the scientific method, the modern scientific method, and the inductive reasoning that goes along with that arose in that golden age of Islam. It popularized the idea that independently verifying experimental methodologies, results, and conclusions is supposed to counter most of the concerns that people have about the subjective nature of perception. And don't get me wrong, I do personally believe that the scientific method is as robust a method as we're going to get for understanding the world with empirical methods, observations, and our senses. What I find interesting is that, like with any model of trying to understand anything, there are always going to be edge conditions, extreme outliers, or complexities in reality that can cause a bit of a breakdown or sort of highlight the limits of the inputs or functions that we've given the systems or models to work with in the first place. So as well as debating the complexities of fairly well understood phenomena, which involves picking apart people's conclusions, highlighting errors and small variances or disparities in observations and conclusions in areas we are still pretty much agreed on or broadly agreed on what the facts of the situation are. What I find even more interesting is the stuff that we cannot explain currently, either because we lack the observations, the equipment, the reasoning, or the availability of the data in the frames of reference that we expect it to manifest. Yet, still we hope to, in future, with sufficient technological advancement, procure said observations or data, and therefore obtain the sacred unified model of reality and the universe and life and everything that is fully explained and would withstand independent testing and critique and peer review. In my video on the 4 elements and my chemical bonding theory of Avatar: The Last Airbender, I spoke briefly about gravity and how the show brings it into the theory of the elements by making gravity interactions possible via an advanced airbending technique, suggesting that since gravity is the fundamental force that brings matter or objects with mass together, that I then proposed that airbending must be a manipulation of the separation between matter, so an advanced airbending technique being able to oppose this force of gravity that brings matter together makes total sense. And I wanted to talk about gravity because it's one of the most obvious things to talk about. I've mentioned it, I think, in every single physics video so far, that it's currently not really accounted for by the standard model of physics because we lack a quantum explanation for gravity. Yet gravity was known to the ancients. Like I said, Canada had laws just like what Newton quantified in the 1600s, well over 2,000 years after Canada. But while the manifestation of gravity as interactions between masses on earthly scales was well understood in terms of motion and densities of weights and objects and simple force interactions, once we began to look at the scales of matter in our universe down to those subatomic levels, down to the quantum levels, as well as on huge cosmic levels, it took special and general relativity theories to quantify and understand the nature of gravity in ways that quite literally shifted reality. It changed the way that scientists view and understand the nature of matter, energy, and space-time. So we have this clearly observable phenomenon of gravity, yet while we understand what it does, pulls masses together and affects the geometry of space-time, we still don't have that crucial verified quantum theory for it to bring it into the standard model. If we do for everything else, for the strong and weak nuclear forces, for the electromagnetic force, why don't we have it for gravity? And it really comes down to how we observe and how we measure quantum particles, quantum effects, and how matter and energy interact in these extreme edge cases. In experiments where this thing is tested, it's either at the really, really small scale or the very, very large cosmic scale, like around black holes. And isn't that awesome? That's simply because of how we take measurements and test for certain things. There's currently this really obvious force that we exist with, that we know about, that we don't yet have a complete quantum picture for, while everything else that we do is just this weird and wonderful quirk in the way that science works and the nature of our reality. So speaking of, I said that there were a few examples. The other examples are mass and energy. Mass is another weird one because what is mass? The amount of stuff a thing has? What stuff? It's mass. So what is its mass? Well, it's the amount of stuff. It's really easy to get into this circular logic and get confused. And it's funny to me how the fundamental things in physics seem really hard to define, and you easily stray into metaphysical or philosophical discussion because you're talking about these fundamental things. And up until the 20th century, understanding mass as weight or as a property related to an object's density, how much stuff there is in a given volume, was good enough, at least for Kepler and Newton. Nowadays, it's much more important to distinguish between what is called the invariant mass or the rest mass, which doesn't change for a given particle at rest, and the inertial mass, which is how much particle resists acceleration or changes to its momentum. Most of the mass that we observe comes from interactions and fields we have quantum theory for, including the previously elusive, relatively recently quantified Higgs field and corresponding Higgs-like particles, but that's not most of the mass in the universe. Through observations of the stars, their motion, and the warping of space-time in certain galaxies, scientists observed stronger gravitational forces than what was accounted for by the visible mass, the visible matter that we have. This is dark matter, and we can only see dark matter either by seeing the way that its mass impacts local gravitational fields and distorts the light traveling through it, indirectly having a consequence on what we are able to observe, or via particle annihilation reactions that produce an excess of antimatter that we can directly observe that we can't currently explain with visible matter. What's bizarre is that this type of matter that we can't see is thought to be the majority of matter in the universe. If that is the case, why can't us beings of ordinary, not dark matter see or interact with it unless it's at very, very small scales or very, very large ones? It's just a complete mystery, and perhaps related to the mysteries of gravity and mass, time will tell, but I find that just bonkers in the absolute best way. Anyway, finally, energy. I spoke about energy and its mysteries a little bit before in one of my earlier videos because it kind of is almost weirder than mass or gravity, as connected as they all are conceptually. Energy is kind of hard to pin down and define, similar to how mass is. Of course, we have equations for it, we have definitions, we observe it, but the substance of the thing, what it actually is kind of harder to fully describe. It's vibrations, it's waves, it's potentials, it's relativistic mass, it's the potential to do work, or it's the work done, or it's heat. All of these are ways of conceptualizing what energy is. And usually we do have to be talking about a specific form of energy in order to measure it. And the easiest one to think about to get what I mean is probably temperature, since we have a direct sense to observe temperature ourselves. It's called thermoception. And heat, since heat is really just the vibration of matter, it's an internal thermal energy store that correlates to the excitability of our particles. Detecting temperature is quite easy and usually pretty important. It keeps us safe from burning or freezing ourselves, as well as other survival and defense mechanisms and so on. Of course, we're only ever actually observing heat changes, and temperature in the sense of degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit don't really mean anything. The numbers only represent a point on a standardized scale between ice and boiling water so that we can compare temperatures as they change. It wasn't until the Kelvin absolute scale of temperature that corresponded to an absolute amount of thermal energy, where 0 on the scale represents the conceptual, theoretical concept of no thermal energy at all, and the increase in temperature represents a corresponding proportional change in the potential amount of mechanical energy available to do work if that thermal energy could be completely transformed into an observable mechanical energy. And that may or may not make sense, but it should make sense since it's something we can sense ourselves and we observe it directly and we have quantified and got equations and standards for. But yet again, we're not really directly measuring something, only the kind of consequences and interactions that it has beyond the intrinsic thing, kind of like gravity. Since temperature is connected to energy and mass, it changes with pressure and density, and that gives us plenty of ways to measure it. You need to know about latent heat and specific heat capacities, representing an internal thermal energy increasing until it stops, while internal energy builds to contribute to a change of state, and then the temperature can rise again until the next change of state. The specific heat capacity of a substance is a constant that represents how much thermal energy a mass will absorb for each degree rise in temperature. So with something with a high specific heat capacity, it can store a lot more heat in the form of internal thermal energy than something with a lower value. And generally, because as we heat up matter, it expands, it increases its volume, therefore lowering its density. That might seem normal enough, especially if you think about gases, but think about the universe. We know, thanks to cosmic background radiation, the average temperature is between 2 and 3 degrees Kelvin, so the vacuum of space is not lacking in energy, and it's also not lacking in matter. We have dark matter, we have gravity everywhere, we have temperature everywhere. So we know that at the time of the Big Bang, it was much, much hotter than that. And as the universe has expanded, it has cooled significantly. You would expect that as that happens, especially because all of the mass, matter, and gravity pulling things together, you would then expect that the expansion would get slower and slower, but what we've observed is the actual opposite of that. The universe's expansion is accelerating. This effect is the dark energy I was just talking about. We have energy driving the expansion of the universe in opposition to the contracting forces of gravity and cooling. And just like the mysterious dark matter is adding extra gravity compared to what we see or expect, dark energy, in all of its anti-gravity glory, is the majority of the universe's total energy, yet we can't see it. It's another property of the universe, of our shared reality, that we can only indirectly observe by its consequences and interactions with the things that we can see. It's commonly thought of as a negative pressure field filling space, similar to the gravitational, electromagnetic, and literally every other field, but which we can't observe except on the absolute largest scales of space because of the dark energy itself is low density. And that's so bizarre because it's so counterintuitive, yet so many fundamental aspects of our existence and our universe are. Observing the unobservable, tweaking our models of reality over and over, and increasing our accuracy and our understanding piece by painstaking piece. Do you think we're ever going to have a completely validated factual model of the reality of our universe, our counterintuitive, mysterious, bizarre universe? Do you think that's possible? Do you think that that is the timeline that we're on? Or do you think that some of these things, like dark matter and dark energy and gravity in our universe, are going to remain inherently unknowable, and that they always will remain unknowable, and that no technological advancement could possibly bridge those gaps in what we can perceive and provide us with data to verify their natures with the scientific method that we currently have? How do we establish what it means to have something be unknown within a logical framework, or what being known even means, or what real even means? I'm back to that liminal space and the existential crisis. Given that kind of issue, I understand why we do rely on our senses, why that makes sense, and why empirical evidence ended up being the path for ancient philosophers of India, credited with our knowledge system of materialism and logic that relies solely on perception of the physical world and validated sensory data. That this then informed later experimental methodologies adopted by scholars and scientists, and even later patriarchal white men decided that rationality, logic, and objectivity were the three kings of scientific knowledge. I do understand this, and I do find these ideas useful as a framework for building knowledge and shared understanding to an extent, because this system isn't the only one, and I find that worth exploring, not in opposition to the scientific method at all, but rather as additions, as extra tools to help us bridge certain gaps, especially as we quite literally approach the edges of the observable universe. Our conscious mind, like Kanada said, is an integral part of processing our observations as living, sentient observers trying to understand our reality through our perceptions and the senses of telescopes, machines, and tools available to give us more data. The mind is seen as a vehicle between interactions in the physical material world and the conscious inner world. This is represented with a very familiar figure, the six-pointed star, overlapping two triads of matter and consciousness to form a yantra. Our perspectives and modes of thought, even our language, have huge impacts on how we process and engage with our reality. Linguistic relativity refers to this phenomenon where certain words or patterns in our language inherently encode how we conceive of certain ideas or engage with our environment. This connects not only to motor signals but to memory, perception itself, and fundamental space-time concepts, which differ when your language and culture are different. Our cognitions help us to process reality, make decisions, and send specific chosen signals to our body and make it do stuff, like move around in whatever direction we want, rather than being coded and programmed purely on instinct. But that's not to disparage instinct or intuitive knowledge. There are multiple ways and systems of building and producing knowledge, of understanding and interacting with reality that stretches beyond human cognitions or sensory input. Don't whales, dolphins, shrimp, squid, bacteria, everything else living down in the ocean have a unique and advanced understanding of the ocean depths, of their currents and realities, that we are still very much in our infancy of applying our scientific method to understanding? Non-human peoples, critters, life forms all have this understanding of their existence that allows them to survive and thrive on instinctive knowledges and unique internal worlds. We only value our own concept and understanding and cognitions as superior just because we said so, because our cognitive processing, reasoning, and abilities feel advanced to us by our own measures and considerations. But there is value to processing instinctive, intuitive understandings of reality without cognition getting in the way. Anyone who has ever stuck their hand out to catch a falling object that they hadn't even seen, or turned their head to perceive, and then marveled at how that was possible, has experienced the power of instinct and intuition, which I believe is just a very fast method of information processing of the senses that bypasses our so-called higher cognitions, such that we don't think about it or consciously have awareness of the processing as or even after it happened. These are reflexes. They still rely on the senses and all of the information that is being picked up that our conscious brain has to filter out, or risk being constantly overwhelmed and dysregulated by it all. We don't have to consciously process every single bit of information our senses pick up. Our bodies can just understand and act accordingly on instinct thanks to so many eons of evolution. I'd say that that was an advanced form of understanding. Advanced because we cannot consciously parse out every data point in that cause and effect chain. When this is applied to a convoluted enough chain of events or a sufficiently complex pattern, people perceive it as magic or as advanced wisdom or intuition. When people make leaps of deduction or reasoning breakthroughs in famous scientific theories that later then become validated, proven, or whatever, they tend to end up down the line told in some story with some mundane or arbitrary leap of imagination, striking or sparking some inspiration that seems to come from the depths of our deeper intuitive modes of thought. If that happens in a situation other than science, the person is called psychic. Was Einstein magical for coming up with the theories of relativity the way that he did before the evidence existed for it? Was Rick magical for making a portal gun, which had to come from some scientific innovation or inspiration? Why don't we call it psychic or magic when it's a scientific leap of thought, inspiration, or imagination? I do think that intuition like that is magic and wonderful and a valuable form of building knowledge and understanding, especially in the way that our conscious mind and what is beyond our consciousness end up connecting and working together, and also in the ways that they work against one another. I say that science is magic because I think reality is magic. I think it's fascinating that what one person perceives, another doesn't. What one person can imagine, another cannot. What one person intuits, another wouldn't. We each exist in our own reality bubble, interpreting the world in a way unique to us with different skills. I like the famous Arthur C. Clarke quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I think it's a gift that we have so many different ways to understand the world and a way to break it down into its fine components that we have a pretty good mathematical description for pretty much everything we'll come to contact with during our lives. Like, how is that not magic, would be my question. In fictional worlds where conventionally conceptualized magic is real, are the wizards, sorcerers, witches, and warlocks that study it suddenly engaging with not magic because they can understand and define, influence, predict, or manipulate it? Of course not. So does that mean that black holes, gravity, dark matter, and dark energy are real magic by the conventional definition then, because we can't empirically understand them right now? Nobody on Earth does. They technically break our current laws of nature as we have them written down, but that if we do ever discover the truth of their natures or discover the laws that govern them, that they'll cease to be magical? Of course, I'm being silly. Like, what I'm really calling into question here is just the simple definition of the word magic. But that's kind of what I'm talking about, like how subjective realities interact, especially via language, and how that in turn impacts how we conceive of reality or our shared reality beyond our own little bubbles, is totally wild to me. Language is flexible, personal, and impacts the way you engage. And I think there's something about the way that I engage with reality that everything the word magic connotes or denotes to me just aligns with the supernatural and the natural world and scientific studies of it. Anything to do with the study of reality feels like magic to me. It just captures and inspires my imagination and passion in a way that I can't summarize with any word other than magical. I think this is why so many scientists love science fiction. We love to tease our imaginations with the concepts of reality where we do understand the universe so intimately that there is no technology beyond our grasp and no mystery we cannot solve or figure out how they fit into that reality. It's tantalizing and magical to envision a world where being a Rick Sanchez and figuring out the portal technology and literally manipulating a series of realities and universes to suit you is completely possible and explainable with the same fundamental principles and scientific method that we use now. That would feel no less magical to achieve. If our identity, our passions, our work involves us finding and making what is currently unknown or unknowable known and knowable to us, the more traditional concept of what is magical beyond our laws of nature might either be a threat to this mindset, warning that the models are wrong, or that there is a finite ceiling will one day hit where we can no longer continue to expand our knowledge, our understanding, or our influence on reality. Alternatively, it could mean that there is something about our frame of reference, the nature of how our particular reality is manifested, the very matter and energy we are comprised of, that only represents a limited portion of our shared reality that inherently cannot fully describe it and maybe never will. Isn't that magical to either not know or know someday? I think if we rely on the principle of the scientific method that we have to either interact with an aspect of reality with our senses or the senses of a machine that will in principle be built to observe something about either matter or energy, since that is what our reality is comprised of, then how do we include the things in our reality like dark energy and dark matter that only have very limited interactions with our energy and matter only at the largest or smallest scales? There's something about existing in a reality where the vast majority of that reality is unknowable that feels magic to me. And like I said, big discoveries or breakthroughs in these types of situations where we kind of reach a limit of what we know usually end up coming from some leap of intuition or imaginative thought, which is not part of the knowledge production system of the scientific method. That also I find very magical. And it may be the only way that we one day end up closing the gaps of knowledge on the mysterious phenomena of dark energy and dark matter. Even if that happens, even if the universe, multiverse, or whatever is infinite and therefore inherently unknowable and unobservable to us, if we reach a limit on understanding the nature of dark energy, dark matter, and our matter and our energy, and we never get to the bottom of things like human consciousness, complex phenomena, extra dimensions, faster than light travel or even time travel, then what does it all mean? What are we trying to do? What's the goal? If understanding our universe has a limit, and there is a limit on what is inferable beyond that limit, and there exists no potential future scientific utopia of intelligence and advancement that would seem like magic to us now, is it still worthwhile to explore and understand everything there is to know about our shared material reality as far as we can? Will we inevitably have to transition to value other modes of knowledge production, systems of classification and categorization that acknowledge the arbitrary and illusory separation of the fields of science, philosophy, and academia that exist today, and become defined by something else instead, maybe based on modes of knowledge production and tools of understanding, so that it becomes clearer how to combine and innovate these knowledge production systems when the main problem facing knowledge producers ends up being the limitation in our methodologies. I value my imagination, intuition, emotions, thoughts, extrasensory experiences, and my sensory experiences all equally as knowledge production tools and systems of understanding the reality I occupy. I find it extremely important in my professional and personal life to understand what's going on, to absorb as much information with all of the tools that I have as possible, to try to understand what's going on with myself, with other people, with the natural world around me. And building mutual understanding relies on skills other than observing objective reality, right? It happens through shared languages, common ideas, expressions, interactions, and shared sensory experiences that build internal subjective understanding and has to constantly update and evolve as we in our relationships do, just like scientific models. What gets muddled is usually when we fail to separate our subjective understanding from that shared objective reality of an experience, and that's what tends to cause conflict. That's when I find objectivity in particular to be extremely useful, and you need to know how your observational perception of a thing is impacting the thing and separate out your influence on it from its own behaviors and events if possible, or at least define these areas. It's the age-old problem of if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? Since perception is reality, reality is just what we perceive, and what happens objectively outside of us is neither here nor there, but sometimes it is somewhere. For interpersonal conflicts, this demands a high level of self-awareness, honesty, and understanding of how your perceptions and internal processing are creating a certain frame of reference that influences your subjective and objective realities that you're observing and experiencing. This involves understanding language, memories, cognitive and social processing, as well as sensory and emotional observations and experiences. For scientists, this demands a high level of self-awareness, honesty, and understanding of how our perceptions and experimental designs are creating certain frames of reference that are influencing the subjective and objective realities that we're observing and recording. This usually involves mapping out the material limitations of what we know that we don't know, and what we currently don't or cannot know, as well as how all of our personal subjectivities as scientists influence both the questions we ask and the way that we frame the answers and interpretations. And this goes even more so for quantum experimentation, where literally the observation directly impacts what you observe. No one person can possibly be objective, not interpersonally and not scientifically, and not even scientific measurements themselves can be perfectly objective, which is why it's so important to have control variables, to understand the experimental design and to be able to critique it and to monitor all of the aspects of the conditions of that experiment. But I don't think objective descriptions and understanding of the universe should even necessarily be some sort of ultimate goal. I think it's a worthwhile goal itself to just keep observing and wondering, recording and sharing our experiences, and be open and curious to updating our beliefs and understanding of the world that we inhabit together, not for some end goal of becoming a universal God who can portal through any reality that we desire or influence the universe in fundamental ways, but because I feel it in my bones that it's joyful, that it comes from a place of loving the universe that we exist in, from seeing the wonder and divinity and magic of it all, and feeling an academic, scholarly, insatiable curiosity to piece it together and pierce that veil and connect known and unknown and propel ourselves into a world of deeper awareness and appreciation. I feel like fully mathematically modeled descriptions of someone else's internal subjective reality is impossible, and perhaps because I also believe that fully knowing the universe is impossible, that's why science and the pursuit of knowledge and understanding all together feel indistinguishable from magic to me. So is what Rick Sanchez can do magic because he's the only one that understands it and can do it in his universe? Or is it not because he does know it? Is he a god because he's the only one with that ability and he's selfish about holding no secrets? Look at what happens when someone else figures out portal tech. They abandon Rick's reality or curve of realities so that the only people left are the people who either cannot figure out what he knows or don't want to leave his domain. Of course, he'd end up as a god figure in that reality. I think both that being a god is overrated and that we are all gods of our own little realities. We choose what to believe, we create a perception based on our internal world and narrative, and we are cognitively biased to play out the same patterns over and over again. I think it's magic that we don't have to fall into those traps, that we can become our own god and choose to live out a different path and live a different reality. But even if what Rick does with portals was possible and real in our universe, and this wasn't just theory and concept and analogy, would it even matter? Would a unified theory that could explain everything feel any less magical than it does in concept while we were unable to do it? Like if we could portal like Rick does that portal technology not still feel magic? And even if we could do it and it didn't feel or seem magical, like I said in my video on bending the elements, what if the lessons of exploring the connections between realities at such a high level are not nearly so important as the connection between the living things and the bonds that we have between one another as peoples existing within that reality? Doesn't Rick himself come to that conclusion in his endless string of living out the same pattern of self-sabotaging relationships, where he realizes his own emotional unavailability is what is precluding him from truly appreciating the people around him? And as important and lofty a goal as understanding the nature of reality in the universe is, it is indeed beyond the scope of one person's life, as Newton said. So while there is definite value in that incremental contribution to knowledge, I maintain my belief, as much as science and knowledge are my truest passions, that nothing is as important as the one life that we have to live here, and we are meant to be here together. We have evolved to exist in community with social and emotional bonds to one another and to the non-human peoples and life around us. There is some deep and ancient magic in understanding the role of our intuitive connections to one another and the extrasensory realities that creates when we come together with a shared goal or vision or purpose. Any knowledge production, any establishment of the nature of reality, any technological advancement or intelligence we pursue, acquire, or even worship should never come at the expense of the lives or well-being of others. Sadly, with genocides, animal testing, systemic marginalization, and oppression, that isn't the case in this reality, and the worship of the scientists has gone to an unhealthy extreme. Regardless of what is or isn't knowable about our reality, whether there even exists an objective singular truth or unified reality, if understanding it doesn't improve our shared understanding of one another or enhance our ability to all survive and thrive together with love and respect, sincerely, everybody, what is the point of pursuing it? What good is it having godlike powers of the nature of reality in ways that are indistinguishable from magic if they're just going to be used by people who don't care about the realities and experiences of others? In my humble opinion, Rick's powers are wasted on him if he doesn't do the work to hold himself accountable for his mistakes, for the ways that he's impacted his family, or the ways that he's harmed countless others in his nihilistic apathy. He's not supposed to be looked up to. His powers aren't meant to be enviable, because they're evidently not. I think what is so compelling about the show is that it's so antithetical to the value and passion that calls me to scientific pursuits, but also so antithetical to my understanding of what understanding reality even is. Everything outside of us is a way of reflecting internally. What good is mastering the unknowable secrets and mysteries of the universe and unknowable realities if you can't use that skill to connect with yourself and your family and friends and understand their unknowable realities? Don't get me wrong, I do think that knowing things and knowing science for science's sake is worthwhile, but I guess it's just my personal outlook and subjective reality that for me, it doesn't matter how incredible or significant a scientist's achievements, knowledge production, or mystery solving work is, if they live a life of sadness, disconnection, marginalization, or never experience what it is to be mutually understood and understanding of another's subjective reality and find that connection and bonding within that space, I pity them and I find it tragic. I don't think it's noble to sacrifice the human connective meaning in your own life for the sake of knowledge production. And I think Rick, up until a certain point, would have agreed with me. I think that he was on that path of knowledge production for knowledge's production's sake, but what was most important to him was his family, and that kind of ended up corrupted because it was taken away from him. So I think there is like a deeper story there. But anyway, the boundaries between categories of things only exist because we say so, and often the reasons for that are more limiting than they are useful or freeing for more knowledge production, creation, experiences, and connection. You just never know what wisdom or insight or inspiration someone that you're connected to will offer, or what situation or life experience will cause you to feel a deep sense of both understanding and wonder at the reality that you inhabit, and respect and appreciation for the reality that someone else has shared with you. I think if nothing exists on purpose and nobody belongs anywhere, then that's more reason for us to enjoy what we have. And I think Morty was very wise and inspired for saying so. In a reality where he's forced to constantly confront the unknowable nature of Rick's ego and technology and how it disconnects Rick from the family, even beyond Rick's emotional abandonment of them all, including himself, Morty ends up becoming the family's emotional nexus who bears the weight of their suffering while appreciating and juggling conflicting multiple realities at once that only gets harder and harder for him as Rick becomes more and more unhinged throughout the show. Rick is a cautionary tale of a character about the risks of pursuing scientific secrets to an extent that you forget that other realities are no less valid when it comes to appreciating our connections to other people, and the necessity of respecting that everyone has a subjective reality they exist in that is as valid as our own. When I say our shared reality, I mean that there is an entanglement, an overlap of our subjective realities coming together when we interact with each other, and some wild, amazing, completely perceivable stuff happens outside of our perception of it, but that it shouldn't really matter what is real or what isn't objectively real if we refuse to live in harmony with the people around us because of it. Rick exaggerates the concept of nihilism and reality being simply a tool in his arsenal to deploy at will to a point of severe self-sabotage and intense disrespect for others. Even if nothing matters and he doesn't care, doesn't that make it more meaningful that others do choose to care? If nothing matters, why not care about each other and work to stay connected in healthy ways, because it's enriching to appreciate one another's realities and create new shared ones. That's quite enough for today. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and if this rambly revision session worked for you, please feel free to check out my other videos that are less chaotic and unhinged in the playlist below. Don't forget that no matter what you believe, the power of our words are very real, so be extra kind to yourself, especially as exams approach. Have a lovely rest of your day. I'll see you next time. Yalla bye.